So now we're going to look at how to create graphic user interfaces, GUIs, of our own. I'm going to walk you through the steps of creating geometry on a screen and then creating interfaces for people to be able to utilize them and be able to manipulate how the geometry is then manifest. We're going to start with a really simple script. There's a void setup and a void draw. In void setup, set the size of the screen to 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels. In void draw, create a background color of 255 white, and then create an ellipse at 500, 500 with a radii of 20 and another radii of 20. Go ahead and run that script. If you run it correctly and it works, you'll have a ball pop up in the middle of the screen. Now we're going to introduce a little bit more variation into the script. We're going to give, instead of specific values to the X and Y position of the ellipse, we're going to give a random function that can pick anything between any number between 0 and the width of the screen 1000 and 0 and the height of the screen also 1000. And what this will do is create an ellipse on the screen. Go ahead and run your script once you have this done. Did you run it? Did you get motion sickness? It's not necessary. It's not very nice to look at. The reason this is happening right now is that every time we draw the ellipse, every time we cycle through the draw loop, we're basically creating an ellipse at a totally different random location every time. So that's why the ellipse keeps on moving. This is not really what we want to do. What we'd like to do is create one random position each time we run the script, as opposed to creating different locations 60 times a second. That's what we'll do in the next slide. So the key from taking the randomness of the ellipse instead of having it happen every time the script loops, which is what creates that kind of erratic flickering strobe effect, and as opposed to just creating a random location every time we run the script, is taking the random number generation out of draw. Right? If the random number generation is in draw, then every time the script loops, every frame, we have a different random number. If we move the random number generation to setup, we basically, every time we run the script, we will only generate the values for the ellipse once. They'll be random every time we run the script, but they'll stick with that as we'll stick with those random numbers as the script loops. So to do that, we need to create two global variables. Both floats. Let's call them X pos and Y pos for X position and Y position. In setup, go ahead and instantiate those values with a random call for the width and the height. Width for X position, height for Y position. And then we'll use those variables to define the X coordinates of the ellipse. If you run this now, you should be able to see one ellipse every time you run the script. Keep on running the script, turning it on and off, and see that the position of the dot changes. So now that we've created a script that'll create one dot in a random location, let's go ahead and create a script that'll create a lot of dots in a random location. And basically the way we're going to do this is by, instead of creating one a value for X and Y positions, we'll create an array of values. And then we'll use for loops to instantiate those values and then use those values to draw an ellipse. So to start off, create an integer variable called total, set it to 200. Really, this number can be anything you want, but in this case, go ahead and make it 200. Then we're going to create two float arrays. An array is being defined or called because it's utilizing the open and closed square brackets after the kind of variable it'll contain. So we're saying we're creating two float arrays, X and Y positions, and they will be new floats with that, and the array size will be determined by the integer total. In void setup, go ahead and create a for loop that will basically instantiate every float variable in x and y positions as a random number. And then in draw, create another for loop, basically saying, hey, for every value in x and y positions, use those values to define an ellipse. This is what's handy about for loops. Now when you run the script, you should see a whole bunch of ellipses on the screen. They shouldn't move around, they should stay static, but they should be in different places every time you run the script. Go ahead and check that out. So if that worked, congratulations, you're almost there. This step might seem daunting, but in some ways it's actually one of the easier steps of the process. We're now going to bring in a slider to control how many of those dots we see on the screen. To a user, it will look like it's how many dots are on the screen, but we know, as we've written the script, that the dots are already determined. It's just how many are we determining, are we showing the user when they move the slider. To do this, go ahead and import the control P5 library. There's instructions on how to bring a library into the script as an option attached to some of the text in today's work session. Go ahead and refer to that if you're not seeing control P5 as an option to import into your script. From there, go ahead and create a control P5 object called CP5. We're then going to instantiate that object within void setup, saying that it's a new control P5 object. We're then going to call upon different methods of this control P5 object to be able to define exactly what kind of object it is. In this case, it's going to be a slider. The slider's value is going to be it's going to be entered into that method. It's going to be total. We'll then set the position at 100 by 50, and then set a range between 0 and 200. It's very important to make sure that you're using the exact same variable name that you want to control. In this case, we want the slider to control the integer total, because the integer total will then defines how many ellipses are being seen in the void draw call. So be sure to have the same case for all the letters, the exact same spelling. It actually makes sense to go ahead and copy whatever that integer name you're using is, probably total, into the method's input in parentheses, in quotations, to be able to make sure that that is completely synced up. If that doesn't happen, you can move the slider around and nothing will change. The position in this case is just kind of in the upper left corner, and then the range is set to 0 to 200. This probably should be set to 0, between 0 and total, but this works as well. Go ahead and run the script. You should now be able to move the slider and see the number of dots change on your screen. With a little luck, you should have something like this. Slider in the top left corner, a whole bunch of dots on your screen. If you did get this, congratulations, huzzah, you have succeeded. This should be able to suffice for your submittal for the assignment today. Go ahead and submit it, or if a team member did this, go have them submit it. There's some other challenges listed in the assignment as well. Go ahead and take those on. If something didn't work, feel free to message me on the discussion boards. I will be there taking a look.